Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our lecture series on Ukraine and research on Ukraine, organized together by ZOiS and Humboldt-Universität. My name is Tatiana Zhurzenko, and I'm a researcher at ZOiS. Tonight I'm replacing Professor Gwendolyn Sasse in her capacity as a chair and moderator of this lecture series, because Gwendolyn is traveling. She might join us from her wherever she is now. But now we will proceed with today's lecture, and we are very happy to welcome tonight Tymofii Brik, who is a Ukrainian sociologist. Tymofii received his PhD in social science at the University of Madrid, and he obtained his master's degree in social research from Utrecht University. He received, in 2018, he received the Natalia Panina Award for the best young sociologist of Ukraine. He was visiting researcher at Stanford University in 2020 and at New York University in 2020 in New York University, 2018 at Stanford. He is an associate professor of the Kyiv School of Economics and head of the school Center for Sociological Research. I cut a long list of his other positions and achievements because Tymofii is actually in a hurry tonight. And to give him more time to talk, let me just mention that 1 week ago he became the newly appointed rector of the Kyiv School of Economics. So actually the youngest rector in Ukraine. And we are very happy for his new position and congratulate him with this appointment. So now, Tymofii, the floor is yours. And after your presentation, I will collect questions from the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. And indeed, I apologize to the audience. Unfortunately, I'll have to come earlier. In total, I have about 40-45 minutes, but I'll try to speak faster so we can have more time for our dialogue. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, but I really apologize for my hectic schedule. So today I want to talk about our ongoing research about mass polarization in Ukraine. Specifically, I will be talking about attitudes and a methodology. How can we measure and understand polarization using attitudinal data? And I'll speak more about that in the next few minutes. So to give you some first introduction on this topic, let's just talk about this word, this term polarization, and how usually it is studied in political science and sociology. Polarization is a very important concept. It has appeared and emerged in many public debates, political debates, and scholarly debates quite recently. So usually when we talk about polarization, we mean disagreement. Yeah, that's people subscribe to increasingly extreme positions. Meaning that, let's give a practical example. You can think about any policy, for instance, gun control, and some people will be pro-gun control, some people will be against gun control, and they cannot agree between each other, and the shares of the proportions of both populations are quite high in the society. In political science, we also disentangle some other alternative mechanisms. For instance, people are often talking about affective polarization, which is a case of positive in-group bias and negative out-group bias, meaning that I'm a member of my party and I like my party and I think that my party is better than another party. And this is also a source of disagreement and polarization in a society. Another phenomenon is partisan sorting, when people sort themselves into parties that match their ideologies. I think the most prominent example now in the world is the case of the United States, Democrats versus Republicans. So sometimes people, sort themselves into Democratic Party, even though maybe the leadership of of either party is not necessarily, the most professional person, or maybe the voter doesn't necessarily agree or subscribe to everything that the leaders believe, but they still they would rather support their own party, regardless what the party is doing. And there are some other, important mechanisms that scholars consider when they study polarization. In political psychology and social psychology, there is a long tradition to understand this question as in-group and out-group issue, whether people have some specific social identities that makes them feel like members of community, and they want to defend this community through some process of mobilization, that people realize that they belong to a community and they need to defend the values or needs of this community versus some other communities. And in sociological perspective, and I am a sociologist, we very often try to find out the social background of individuals and whether social economic background can tell us something about the roots of polarizations that may be due to inequalities or negative economic growth or some sort of a social status deprivation. People can have stronger attachment to their communities, and therefore polarization emerges. In the US philosophical tradition and scholarly tradition, when they study polarization, usually it's a story about Democrats versus Republicans. In Europe, we often refer to these issues when we talk about radicalism and populism. So why people vote for radical parties. And most scholars usually agree that polarization is something bad for our societies. It is bad for people, how we build social ties with others, how we connect to each other. It's not nice when we always fight with each other, but also polarization has negative consequences for political stability and economic outcomes. For instance, due to growing polarization, people can elect populists, and populistic leadership often brings negative consequences for economic policies. So this is kind of broad outlook of polarization and how usually polarization is understood in international scholarship. And this is just an example from one of the quite famous and often cited papers about affective polarization. So this is a metric which asks people in surveys. People are asked whether they feel warm towards their party or cold towards other parties, and we see that this with time this type of polarization increases, that people have kind of stable positive feeling towards their own party and unfavorable views towards other parties. Another representation of this effect is often done by political scholars who study not necessarily attitudes of people, but also behavior of politicians and their voting behavior. So this slide shows you the US House of Representatives, with blue dots being Democrats and red Republicans. And in previous decades, they had more ties with each other, meaning that they supported similar legislation. But over the case, we see this clusterization effect, that Democrats and Republicans rarely support similar legislation. And this is one of the methods we can use to visualize polarization in behavior. But what do we know about Ukraine when we ask this big question? What can we tell about polarization in Ukraine? And surprisingly, we know quite little. So we often perceive Ukraine through the lenses of conflicts and disagreements, but in fact, the scholarly literature on polarization in Ukraine is quite small, I would say. So we have some part of the literature which is I can broadly call regional studies. There are a lot of sociologists and political scholars who address regional variation in voting. And we know, from many decades of Ukrainian independence, 3 decades, I don't know, I think it's many. So from 3 decades of Ukrainians independence, we know that there are quite a lot of regional variations. So you can think about, let's say Yushchenko and Yanukovych, how different regions supported different candidates. We can think about voting for Poroshenko or for pro-Russian or more pro-European parties. So we often see this regional variation. Nevertheless, it's not easy to attribute this specifically to polarization. I don't know a lot of studies that would specifically test the effect of polarization, because there are so many alternative mechanisms that can bring this outcome. So we don't really know. If we look at the map of voting and we see these differences, we don't really know what is happening. Is this about polarizing effects of economic or identity policies that the candidates push for, or is this about polarization about geopolitical views among voters, or this is just about charismatic politicians that the figures are polarizing voters? We don't really know how to disentangle these questions. Then we also know something from other scholars of Ukraine who study identities. They show from different data that from 2014, there was sort of a unification process of identities in different Ukrainian regions. We also know about the effect of Zelensky, that so many Ukrainians from different regions who used to vote for, who used to be quite different in their political preferences, suddenly they all support Zelensky. And usually when we say the word polarization, we kind of imply that this is something very deep, something substantial that cannot be changed overnight. And apparently it can in Ukraine with a new candidate. So that's why I'm hesitant to say, was there any polarization in the first place? Maybe we're just confusing polarization with something else. And I can I can talk about many other alternative mechanisms that can influence attitudes of Ukrainians. There was this excellent research by Leonid Pesakhin from NYU Abu Dhabi. He conducted surveys within one region, one oblast, Khmelnytska Oblast, when he basically divided the oblast in 2 parts. One used to be in Habsburg Empire, and another used to be in the Russian Empire. And he also identified the socialization mechanisms of respondents, that some respondents, they grew up going to church, Greek Catholic Church or Orthodox Church. They grew up with elderly family members. So basically his research showed that we still observe these long historical legacies, that people who grew up in different modes of socialization, they have different geopolitical preferences. So this is not exactly about polarization. Yeah, it's just about some long history and institutions that shape voting preferences of Ukrainians. So I'm saying all that just to emphasize that there are so many different alternative mechanisms that can bring this variation in voting, that it's very difficult to attribute it to some specific cause. We don't know to what extent polarization is a driving cause of that, or maybe something else. Alternatively, there is another very big field of studies in Ukraine, which is about ideologies. Sociologists have studied ideological preferences of Ukrainians since the 90s. And this literature also shows quite a lot of mixed results, that, if sociologists approach respondents and they ask them on the scale, from 0 to 10, 0 means left, and 10 means right, can you position yourself on this scale? And most respondents, they don't know how to answer this question. They position themselves somewhere in the middle, or they say difficult to answer. Also, if you present Ukrainians with a list of ideologies and you ask whether you are left or right, libertarian or socialist or communist, most Ukrainians also would say that they don't know. So Ukrainians are not really well educated about their ideologies. Ideological preferences are not articulated in Ukrainian society. And there are some other scholars who say that, ideological motivation of Ukrainians is conditioned on economic circumstances. Depending on the electoral cycle, people just change their preferences. And some other scholars like Yevgen Holovacha, he studied this effect of double conscious for many years. Basically, he claims that usually same people, same respondents, they have at the same time, they can have conflicting preferences about the world. They can both support democracy, but also strong authoritarian leadership. They can support capitalism, but at the same time, they would support redistributive policies. So basically, this literature shows that there is a lot of mess in answers of Ukrainians. So to sum up this slide, I would say that we know very little about the actual effect of polarization on electoral behavior of Ukrainians, because we know little about their preferences in the first place. There is another survey which I conducted with my colleagues some years ago. We asked Ukrainians 10 questions about economic freedoms and regulations, and then about moral issues and regulations. So for instance, would you agree that land markets should be free? And then we asked, what do you think about marijuana usage or the role of females in the household? So most respondents appear to be quite pro-regulation on both scales, on the scale of economy policy and scale of moral issues. Most Ukrainians agreed that they would like to regulate everything. So state must have a strong influence on economy, but also people should be very strict in their behavior. So that's the majority of Ukrainians. They want to regulate everything. So Ukraine is confusing. Yeah, if we want to put all this into all these slides on some to summarize all these slides, it's not really clear what is happening. So on the one hand, we know that Ukrainians are not very aware of their ideologies. Then we also know that most of them support regulations, but they still vote for different candidates. Even though they have similar preferences, they still pick different candidates. As long as it's not Zelensky, a lot of Ukrainians supported Zelensky, even though he promised deregulation, but we know that Ukrainians support regulation. So we have a lot of counterintuitive findings that do not always, add up into one coherent picture. That's why it's very difficult to study this issue of ideologies, preferences, and polarization. And that's why my colleagues and I, we decided to try an alternative methodology. When you don't understand things, you just bring new method and make everything even more complicated. So that's what we decided to do. Most of the previous studies were based on some sort of ad hoc approach. Different scholars, different researchers, based on their personal preferences, they choose one or two questions to measure ideology. For instance, do you support this one policy? Do you support entering NATO? Or do you support capitalism? Do you support democracy? So a researcher picks one question and then analyzes this one question, implying that this scale can tell us something about polarization in a society, but I think it's not very coherent in a way that political beliefs, they have structure. There could be many different issues and people might have different opinions about these issues. So it is important to understand the whole structure of beliefs of people and to understand which attitudes are central and which attitudes are not. So that's why we use this social network analysis approach, which states that polarization is something opposite to cross-cutting pluralism. And I will explain what it means. So imagine that people have different attitudes. Let's say, I like coffee, but I also like jazz and I like democracy. And you can find correlation between these, that people who like specific lifestyle, they also like specific political ideas. So when you have correlation there, this is one scenario. But imagine, that you have a friend and you want to talk with this friend, and you always disagree on something, you know, that let's say you like coffee, but this person likes tea. You like jazz, but this person likes, I don't know, hip hop. You like democracy, this person doesn't like democracy. So this is bad. This implies some sort of polarization, meaning that we cannot agree on some things. And the good scenario in this example, the good scenario is what is called cross-cutting pluralism, meaning that there is no correlation between lifestyle and political views and some other political views. Let's say that it doesn't matter if you like tea and I like coffee, we still can communicate. We still can find some other topic to be friends on some other positions. Okay. We cannot agree on music, but we both like sport. So we can jump from one topic to another topic. If you can actually do that, then we call it pluralism. And if we cannot jump to any other topic, we call it polarization. And this is a visualization in one of the papers by Della Posta, who publishes a lot on these matters in the, you know, in leading journals. So here he visualizes this idea that this visualization is not about people. These nodes, they represent ideas. And these ideas, they can be clustered or not necessarily clustered. So the problem when all ideas become when we observe more consolidation, it means that we are trapped. That you can take one idea, and from this idea you can predict all other ideas in the network. Yeah, so you know, if this person drinks tea, it's likely that this person also likes jazz, and it's likely that this person supports democracy. So when everything is in one cluster, it means that consolidation happened, and basically this is a case of polarization. So what we want to do in our study, we want to use this approach and apply it to surveys conducted in Ukraine. So what we're going to do, we will take answers of Ukrainian respondents, and we will analyze questions as nodes in the network. So we will be looking into the correlations between these nodes. And we don't really care if the correlation is positive or negative. Yeah, it doesn't matter if, you know, if I like coffee, then I hate democracy, or if I hate coffee, then I hate democracy. We don't care about the sign, plus or minus. The most important, there should be some correlation. And we will build matrices of correlations between answers of Ukrainians. So we have data from 1994 to 2016. Most of these surveys were annual, sometimes biannual. And there are 70 items that are repeated in all of these questionnaires. And these items are either about lifestyle or about attitudes. For instance, I don't know, do you trust president? Are you interested in politics? Or do you prefer to go to theater? Something like that. But we do not include demographic questions or questions about your past, like how many kids you have, or I don't know, whether you're employed or not. So we include only attitudinal and lifestyle questions. And we use social network analysis tools to detect these clusters. So this is 1994. Each node is just an answer in the questionnaire. Yeah? It's a question in the questionnaire. And what's happening here, basically chaos. It's a mess. We don't see any correlation here. So there is no polarization in 1994. You cannot say that your preference towards politics correlates to your lifestyle or whatsoever. So there is we don't see any correlations in 1994. And here I just plot these graphs for each year, and you see that from 1994 to 2004, nothing happens. Ukrainians are the space of ideas is not structured. But then with 2005, something happens, and the space of ideas becomes quite structured. And we know what happened in 2004, Orange Revolution happened. So after Orange Revolution, Ukrainian structure of ideas have become much more clustered than it used to be. And it has remained clustered ever since. So what are these ideas? So to give you an example, this is 2005. We see 3 clusters. Some items are about freedom of speech, political leadership, trust to government and president, and satisfaction of life. So basically, in 2005, there is a correlation. So you know that if, let's say, if you know that person trusts to government, you can also predict the level of life satisfaction of this person in 2005. It was not the case before, but apparently this correlation emerged after the Orange Revolution. Other clusters are about, participation in specific political parties and interest in politics in general, and other questions are about lifestyle. So how to interpret this graph? I don't want to say that the conclusion is not that there are some people in Ukraine, some of them like jogging, and others are interested in politics. This is not the case. The correct interpretation would be that there is a space of ideas in Ukrainian society, and apparently these ideas became more structured. That after Orange Revolution and after these significant political events, that it kind of reshaped how Ukrainians now think about the world. And after 2014, political beliefs, political attitudes became quite correlated with how Ukrainians feel about themselves and their well-being. And that's it. I promise to be quick. So what we did in this study, we replicated some of previous findings in the literature using Ukrainian data. We see that attitudes become more politicized in Ukraine, and we also do not see cultural wars, which is nice. So, for instance, there is an argument that in the US and some Western societies, basically, if you can predict lifestyles of people, you can also predict their political behavior, and this has damaged social fabric of a society, but we do not observe this effect in the Ukrainian society. Well, I'll stop here, and I'll try to clarify things in Q&A. Thank you. Oh, Tatiana, you're muted.
Sorry. So a couple of questions already in the chat. Do your findings suggest that there is a certain foundation in Ukrainian society for the emergence of more ideologically oriented political parties? And the question from Gwendolyn, what happens to ideas about regional identities in this clustering? Are they relevant?
Yes, so I'll start with the second question. Yes, it is correct that in these surveys, there are questions about identities. In this specific survey, the questionnaire is constructed in the following way. So people are asked, whom do you identify with? Do you feel like you are? And then there are some options. Ukrainian citizen, or I'm a dweller of my town or my city, or I'm the former USSR citizen. I'm the citizen of the world. So what we did, we recoded this question into dummy variables from 0 to 1. And we know, so that's how we recoded the data. And then in the cluster themselves, these questions, they go to the second cluster. So when people are talking about their political membership in political parties, interest in policies, but also membership in, what I called community, being a member of local town or feeling that, identifying that they're Ukrainian citizens. So these identity questions, they go to this second cluster. And this is interesting because they do not necessarily correlate with the first cluster of trust to politics or well-being. And to answer to the former question about parties, I don't know. It's difficult to say. So far, I think the empirical answer is no. Almost all new parties that are successful in Ukraine, even today, they always start with some kind of populistic agenda. I think they all very successful in triggering the attention of politically motivated people, but without people are just interested in politics, in specific policies, in their life well-being, but people are not necessarily responding to ideological parties.
Okay, next question also, I think directly concerns your research. Did you observe any change in the way the selected questions were clustered after 2014? Or did the pattern of clustering remain unchanged?
That's a very fundamental question. Interestingly, the pattern remains the same. And we also, I also added some additional analysis. In social network analysis, we can also measure a metric of centrality, degree centrality specifically. So we can say which of these attitudes are more important compared to other attitudes. And those attitudes that had the higher degree centrality, they also remain the same after 2005. And they are from the first cluster, mostly it's a trust to president, trust to government, satisfaction with life. So these are mostly the most important items. Meaning that if you know something about them, you can predict everything else from them. Well, not everything, I'm exaggerating, but that would be one of the interpretation here of degree centrality. So if you know something about your respondent, whether they trust the government, from this small piece of knowledge, you can anticipate other answers. Yeah, and there was a question from Volodymyr Kulik, I think. Yeah.
Yes. Is this polarization only about identities and ideologies, or also about values more generally?
Oh, I think it's in this specific case, it's just about everything in general. So we did not select specific questions based on on theory or thematic subject behind this question. We just took all the questions that are repeated in all waves, and all questions that are about attitudes or identity, values, or lifestyle. So we were afraid that if we make any selection of the questions, then the results would be driven by our choice. Instead, we took everything that was there. So this polarization is about everything.
Could you please specify which method did you use to perform the cluster analysis?
Yeah, it's a walk trap algorithm here.
Okay, and the next question, do we know anything about the direction of this relationship in the cluster, as if more trust in the government is positively or negatively correlated with trust in clergy?
Yeah, by design, we don't. So by design, the way how the data was constructed, the matrices of correlation, we ignored positive or negative signs. Simply, as I said, by design, we're interested if there is any connection or not to build these clusters. It is technically possible to go back to data and check it, but for these purposes, we were not interested in this exercise.
Okay, maybe I will add my question to this discussion. You said in the conclusion that the no culture wars in Ukraine. And I wanted maybe you to elaborate on this and ask you for your definition of culture wars, because in Ukraine, we often talk about memory wars, for example, the attitudes to decommunization.
Yeah.
I don't know, the attitudes to the status of Russian language. Isn't it something which can be called culture wars in our context? And maybe the question related to this, in the US literature on culture wars, there is this kind of repeating question, re-emerging question: who is actually polarized, the elites or the people? Yeah. So what would you say in relation to Ukraine? What is the role of the elites in this polarization?
No, absolutely. Yeah, what you just said is often also referred to these sorting mechanisms. Yeah, that in fact parties or party leaders are more polarized than people. And yeah, I guess I was too liberal in using this term cultural wars. So it's good that you corrected me. So basically, what I meant, and I need to clarify that, is that lifestyle questions are not correlated with political questions. So here in this cluster, in the bottom, there are questions about whether people, jogging in the morning or attend movies or theaters. So imagine if, let's say, going to theaters would correlate to trust to president or something like that. That would be a completely different world, a completely different scenario, when you know that there are some cultural groups, that people who go to theaters, they belong to some niche or social group, and let's say they support one type of politics, and people who prefer, I don't know, TV or movies, they support another type of politics. In the US, the same author, De La Posta, he wrote a paper, Why Democrats Drink Latte. So apparently in the US, you can predict if a person drinks latte, they're more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. And so far, we do not observe this lifestyle mingling with political attitudes in Ukraine. So in this sense, I said we don't have cultural wars. On the other hand, you're absolutely correct that there are important identity policies in Ukraine, important questions about our language, our history, and people do not always agree with each other in these questions. And yeah, I think it's important to make this distinction. And in terms of elites, yeah, I think even if you go back to this abrupt change in after the Orange Revolution. So Orange Revolution was a big political event which reshaped attitudes of people, and there is no way it reshaped it directly. You cannot just wake up in the morning and say, oh, yesterday we have Orange Revolution, so now I'm a completely new person. It doesn't happen like that. Yeah, it happens through media debates, through political debates, through changes in political discourses. Yeah, and then changes in political discourses, they influence how people respond and how people form their worldviews about the world. So definitely, I think in Ukraine, these big political events and political elites and parties, they influence mass attitudes indirectly through reshaping political narratives. That's what I think.
Thank you, Tymofii. I think I will now read a couple of questions, and maybe you can, in the remaining time, because I think you have limited time left, right? Try to answer what you prefer. So one question: could constant pressure from Russia, for example, in 2004 and 2014, will be one reason for limited polarization, like a factor from outside which glues together society? So this is one question. And so there were also questions about the dynamics of polarization and the Zelensky effect Is this effect some aberration with no link to what you describe, or is it linked to an actual shift in the dynamics of polarization? I think maybe we stop with these two questions.
Yeah, no, I see the questions in the chat. I think they all are very, excellent questions. I hope I can answer to them. So about 2014 and the influence or pressure from Russia, I don't know. I think in a very generic terms, I think that big political events matter. So it can be some sort of a big competition of elites in Ukraine. It can be big geopolitical events. So of course, this large-scale events or some large-scale mechanisms, they of course influence how people respond at the local level and how they frame their political agenda at the local level. So there should be some connection, but I don't know the exact mechanism here. I did not study it, but theoretically it's plausible. So about Zelensky effect, there are two different people who ask questions about Zelensky. So I just want to clarify that what I meant is rather a juxtaposition of two different observations. So on the one hand, we used to live in one Ukraine when there was a strong regional variation in voting. And now, with Zelensky, the regional variation was not so strong. There were some regions like the city of Kyiv or Lviv Oblast that voted not like other cities, but we saw the reduction of this variation. And I used this example just to say that we used to believe, a lot of pundits and journalists and sometimes scholars, they believe that Ukraine is very much fractured and disconnected society. And people often say that this is very deep in Ukraine and it cannot be changed. But then we see next electoral cycle and apparently things can change. And I just wanted to stress that there is a lot of fluidity in Ukrainian society, and there is a lot of things that can change abruptly, and we should keep it in mind. And going to some other questions in the chats, there was a question about the fact that life satisfaction correlates with politics, but not with lifestyle. And yes, I think that's exactly the most fascinating finding, that maybe it was not the case before. It was not the case in the 90s, but it was not the case in the early 2000s. But after 2004, after Orange Revolution, apparently there is a strong connection between what people think about politics and what people think about their life and how they're happy with this life. And I think this is a very important, development in our history, in history of Ukraine, that now our life satisfaction really depends on political circumstances. And that's what Ukrainians believe, that's how they feel. So our society has become quite politicized in this sense. And there was a question to summarize trends in economic and political polarization in Ukraine. And maybe I can make some predictions, but, I think we live in a very, very difficult and challenging times in Ukraine. And I'm sure that a lot of things will change, specifically because of the direct effects of war on demographic and social economic circumstances. We will see an increase in inequalities. People have unequal access to shelter, to food, to education, to job markets. So economic inequalities will definitely profoundly shape Ukrainian society. In the short term, what we observe now, we see that there is this effect of rally around the flag, that people are mobilized, people are supportive of the government. So this effect of national mobilization mitigates disagreements between Ukrainians, but I think in the long term, we should really think carefully and address the issues of inequalities, because economic inequalities, they usually always bring political polarization.
Thank you very much, Tymofii. Indeed, it's, I think, a very pressing question: what will happen to to the situational unity we are experiencing now, and what is behind this kind of situational unity? Okay, so I think if we have no questions left, and probably you are under pressure to now to join other meetings related to your new responsibilities. We are very thankful for your lecture. It was an exciting exchange and a lot of food for thought, I think. Thank you very much for sharing with us your new research, and hope to see you at other platforms and listen to your academic findings. And to our audience, to our people who joined us this evening, I also would like to thank you for wonderful questions, and invite you to join our next lecture in 1 week. So
thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.